All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into something I think a lot of people can relate to, at least a little bit. Workplace romances.
Ah, yes, the age-old tale of love and labor. Always an interesting mix.
And today it gets even more interesting because we're specifically looking at what happens when those office romances go bad, like really bad,
Oh,
to the
damn.
point where someone cries sexual harassment.
Yeah, that definitely adds a whole new layer of complexity.
Exactly, because then it's not just hurt feelings and awkward coffee breaks, but actual legal and ethical implications.
Right, and that's where things can get really murky.
That's what really grabbed my attention in this 2005 article by Charles A. Pierce and Herman Aquinas. It's a Guinness, like the beer.
Ah, good to know.
They actually argue that sometimes illegal behavior might get overlooked if it's not seen as unethical.
That's a pretty provocative idea.
It really is. And it gets even more complicated when you think about the fact that nearly 10 million office romances start every year in the U.S. So the potential for things to go wrong is huge.
Absolutely. And the authors point out that both romance and sexual harassment technically fall under the umbrella of social sexual conduct at work.
Right, so even if a company doesn't have a specific rule against dating, things can still get ethically messy.
Especially when you factor in power dynamics between employees and just how messy breakups can be in general.
You're sure. So how do we even begin to untangle this knot?
Well, the authors lay out a three-stage decision-making process that investigators typically go through when handling these types of claims.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the first step?
So the first step is to evaluate the conduct itself and impose an ethical standard. Basically, the investigator is trying to determine if the behavior in question actually constitutes sexual harassment. And here's the catch. They're doing this through the lens of their own personal sense of right and wrong.
Ah, so right from the get-go, the investigator's personal beliefs about morality are already playing a role.
Exactly. The authors call these personal beliefs ethics schemas, and they can significantly influence how the investigator perceives the whole situation.
I see. So even before any legal analysis is done, there's already a level of subjectivity involved.
That's right. But then in stage two, things get a bit more objective because that's when the investigator puts on their legal hat, so to speak.
Okay, so what happens in this legal stage?
This is where they start applying established legal standards, like the reasonable person test, to assess whether the behavior actually qualifies as illegal sexual harassment.
So they're trying to look at the situation impartially, putting aside those initial gut feelings.
You'd hope so, right? But here's the thing.
I have a feeling those gut feelings don't just magically disappear.
You're right on the money.
Yeah.
And that's what makes stage three, responding to the claim, so fascinating.
Okay, so even if the behavior is legally considered harassment, those initial ethical judgments from stage one are still lurking in the background.
Precisely. And those judgments, those ethics schemas, can influence how the investigator decides who's responsible and what actions should be taken.
So it's like, even if someone technically crossed the line, the investigator might not come down too hard on them if they personally don't think it was that big of an ethical deal.
You got it. That's exactly what Pierce and Aquinas are suggesting. They highlight this possibility of illegal behavior being essentially condoned just because the investigator doesn't see it as morally wrong.
That's kind of a scary thought. Are there certain types of investigators who might be more likely to let things slide like that?
Well, the authors describe two contrasting types of investigators, which I think helps explain this dynamic.
I'm listening.
So first, you have the relativistic investigator, who doesn't believe in hard and fast moral rules. They're more likely to be lenient and consider the context of the situation, especially if it doesn't seem like there was any malicious intent behind the behavior.
So they're more understanding, more willing to see things in shades of gray.
Exactly. Then you have the idealistic investigator, who operates according to a very strict moral code.
Okay, so this type of investigator is more likely to condemn the behavior regardless of any mitigating circumstances.
Precisely. They see things in black and white, right and wrong.
I see where this is going. You could have two investigators looking at the same situation and potentially coming to very different conclusions based on their personal ethical frameworks.
Exactly. And that's where things start to have real implications for the workplace.
So we were talking about how an investigator's personal sense of ethics can really color how they see these workplace romance situations. One investigator might let something slide, another might not.
And that lack of consistency can be really problematic. I mean, for the employees, if the rules feel arbitrary, it can breed a lot of resentment.
Yeah, it makes it seem like it all comes down to luck of the draw. You get one investigator, you might be in hot water, get another, and you're totally fine, even if you did the same thing.
Right, exactly. And that kind of uncertainty, that feeling that there's no clear standard, it erodes trust in the system, you know? No one wants to feel like the rules are being applied unfairly.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what can companies actually do about this? It's not like you can just force everyone to have the same moral compass.
You're right, you can't change people's core values, but you can create a framework that helps guide their decision-making.
Okay, how do you do that? Where do you even start?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to have a really crystal clear policy about workplace relationships.
So, no more of this figure it out yourselves approach. Spell it out black and white.
Exactly. Clear boundaries and expectations. Everyone knows where they stand, what's acceptable, what's not, and that can help investigators be more objective when they're evaluating these situations because they have something concrete to refer to.
Makes sense. So, clear policies, that's one thing. What else can organizations do?
Training. Training is crucial, for investigators. They need the skills to recognize their own biases, how their personal feelings might be influencing their judgment.
Right, so they can apply the rules consistently, regardless of their gut reaction.
You got it. And it's not just about the investigators either. It's important for employees to understand the policies too.
Right, they need to know what's acceptable and what's not, what the consequences are.
Exactly. Education is key because knowledge is power.
For sure. But beyond policies and training, I feel like there's got to be something deeper, something more foundational to creating a truly ethical workplace.
You're absolutely right. And that's about cultivating a workplace culture that really values respect and open communication.
So it's not just about having rules on paper, but about creating an environment where people actually feel safe speaking up, raising concerns.
Precisely, where they know they'll be heard and taken seriously. And that starts with leadership. Leaders need to set the tone, model respectful behavior, and actually demonstrate that they take these issues seriously.
Right, so it can't just be lip service. It's got to be, they've got to walk the walk.
100%. And that means taking action, swift and appropriate action, when someone crosses a line, no matter who's involved.
So no sweeping things under the rug. No playing favorites.
Absolutely not, because that just undermines trust and sends the message that the rules don't apply equally to everyone.
Right. I mean, what you're describing sounds like an ideal workplace, right?
Right.
Where everyone feels valued and respected. But how do you get there, realistically?
It's an ongoing process. It takes time. It takes consistent effort from everyone. Companies need to make sure their policies are communicated clearly, reinforced through training, and that they're actually enforced when someone steps out of line.
So it's about putting those policies into action, making sure they're not just gathering dust somewhere.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that policies, training, they're all part of a bigger picture. A workplace is made up of individuals.
Like people making choices.
Right. And that brings us back to our initial question, about how employees themselves can navigate these tricky situations.
So we've talked about the investigator's role, how companies can try to build a more ethical workplace. But what about the average employee? How do they handle this whole minefield of office romance?
Well, that's the real question, isn't it? You can have all the policies and procedures in the world, but it ultimately comes down to individual choices, people making decisions in the moment.
So let's say you're thinking about taking the plunge. You're interested in someone at work. Any advice?
Oh, I'd say proceed with caution, definitely. Office romances can be great, don't get me wrong, but there's always a level of risk involved, especially when you think about the impact on your professional life if things go sour.
It's like that old saying, don't dip your pen in the company ink. Or maybe that's dating back a bit far.
Right, but the sentiment still applies. Before you get involved with someone at work, it's crucial to think about those potential conflicts of interest. Power dynamics. How will things play out if you break up?
It's almost like you need a relationship prenup. Lay everything out up front before things get messy.
Love that analogy. It's about protecting yourself, your career.
Okay, so what if you're already in a relationship with a coworker? How do you handle things then?
Communication, communication, communication. Can't stress that enough. Talk to your partner. Set boundaries, expectations. How are you going to deal with professional challenges that might arise because of your relationship?
So don't just assume everything will be fine, actually talk it through.
Right. And don't forget about those company policies we talked about. Make sure you both understand the rules and that you're okay with the potential consequences.
So no sneaking around trying to bend the rules to fit your situation.
Exactly. Transparency is key. And I think it's important to be aware of how your colleagues are perceiving your relationship, how it's coming across.
So maybe keep the PDA to a minimum. No making out by the water cooler.
Probably wise. You don't want to make anyone uncomfortable or create a perception of favoritism.
Good advice. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners as we wrap up our deep dive into office romance?
Well, I think the bottom line is that navigating romance at work is a balancing act. It requires you to be thoughtful, to communicate openly and honestly, and to be really self-aware.
Right? It's about being proactive, respecting both your personal and professional life, making responsible choices.
You nailed it. And hey, if you're ever unsure about something, don't hesitate to reach out to HR or a trusted mentor. Get some guidance.
Great advice. Well, that wraps up our deep dive today into workplace romance, harassment, and that fascinating intersection of ethics and the law. Hope you all learned something.
Thanks for having me.